So we're just going to do we're going to start with a short little introduction, and then we're going to get right into our guest speakers. So the talk today is Designing Tomorrow's Strategic Design for a Sustainable Future. And as I mentioned, we're a group based at the University of Arizona, UX at UA. Here is kind of a list of the current organizers, but we're spread across the university, some in UX roles, some in communications roles like myself, and some in more technology roles, some working in the library. So you'll see a lot of these faces here today, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And if you want to stay in the loop, here's our website, email. We post all of our events on Meetup. We also share them on LinkedIn and Instagram. And we do also have a Slack channel that you can join where we share events, opportunities, jobs, but that's a really good way for us to stay connected. So feel free to connect with us on any of these channels. We'd love to kind of see you all there. And so we just want to start also by saying that all are welcome here. So we really want to provide a safe and inclusive experience for everybody. So please be kind, show respect, be an ally, follow the rules. You can go ahead and read our community guidelines, but we just ask that create this a great, we ask that you make this a great experience for everybody. So we appreciate you all being here. And a shout out for the UX participant pool. So you can learn more about UX research by joining the UX participant pool and improve a lot of our services and websites. There's a link right there. You can sign up in a minute and you'll receive occasional requests for surveys, user interviews, and usability tests. So it's kind of a fun way to see UX practice in the real world and practice at the University of Arizona. And it's kind of a cool way to learn being on the other side of it as well. We also offer UX consulting. So these are UXA volunteers, and they offer consulting for any UX related questions. It's free for anybody in this community. There's a link right there, and a few of our organizers on this call are part of it. So please feel free to check it out if you want to consult with any of us. You can also find a mentor, especially if you're a student or someone looking to get into UX. We do provide mentorship and provide kind of some just insight into UX, especially from our organizers. We can kind of show you what we do and the different roles that we have as well. So feel free to take a look at that as well if you're interested. And we also have the UX cookbook, which is a super fun part of our website. These are recipes to get you started with everything in UX, from user research, design, testing. It's created by the organizers of UX at UA. So it's a really fun way to kind of really apply UX in a more easy to use way. So please feel free to give that a look on our website. Also just want to take an opportunity to say, if you're hiring, looking for a job, have questions, please raise your hand and let us know, drop it in the chat. We're going to have some guest speakers here today, but you can always feel free to reach out to us organizers or ask any questions. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. So they're on a totally different, they're in the future, which is really cool. So we have two speakers joining us today for our presentation. So I'll go ahead and let them introduce ourselves. But I also wanted to mention that they have a book that we're really excited to give away today. So if you introduce yourself in the chat and share why you attended today's event for a chance to win, you can win this copy of Designing Tomorrow. So we'll announce the winner at the end of the meetup, and it's eligible for those living in the United States, unfortunately, since we have to mail it to you. So please go ahead and take that opportunity to, even if you were to introduce yourself in the chat, you feel free to do it again so you have a chance to win this book. So you can go ahead and do that anytime during the talk. And with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And I'm gonna go ahead and let Martina and Steve go ahead and introduce themselves and get started. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Martin, I'm off mute already, so I might start with the introductions. My name's Steve Baty. I'm coming to you from Sydney, Australia. The traditional owners of the land on which I am coming from are the Wongal clan of the Eora Nation, which is a clan that lived on the banks of one of the major rivers in the Sydney Harbour system. Um, my background, I sort of founded and run a strategic design firm called Meld Studios. I am the current CEO of the Australian Design Council, and I recently took up a position as a director on the Product Stewardship Centre of Excellence out of the University of Technology, Sydney. And I had the privilege and pleasure of being co-author with Martin on this book, Designing Tomorrow. Martin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And thank you, Caroline, for the introduction, and great to meet everyone. Thank you everyone for joining, for taking the time to join this session and to listen to our presentation. My name is Martin Tomitsch. I've worked a little bit as a UX designer in the industry as well, but spent the majority of my career and time at universities, teaching user experience design, interaction design, creativity, and innovation. I'm currently the head of the Transdisciplinary School at UTS, the University of Technology, Sydney. And UTS has a strategic partnership with the University of Arizona. So I was fortunate a few months ago as part of that partnership to visit Tucson and the University of Arizona there. And was also able to meet with some of the organizers of UX at UA. And so really grateful that we have this opportunity to give a presentation about our book today as part of the UX at UA Meetup. I'm joining you from Sydney, which is and the University of Technology Sydney campus, which is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which our campus, our university campus, stands. Now, our book, and maybe I should say a little bit about how the session is going to run today. We're going to walk you through some examples and some of the strategies strategies and tools that we discuss in the book. Steve and I will be also reading short sections from the book. And then we'll have some time for Q&A as well. So yes, please feel free to keep posting questions that you might have in the chat, and Steve will sort of address them depending on the questions and the flow of the session, either as part of our talk and or at the end of the session today. So our book is called Designing Tomorrow, Strategic Design Tactics to Change Your Practice, Organization, and Planetary Impact. And it's published with BIS Publishers. They're based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. They're a great little boutique publisher that focuses on publishing books and also toolkits, card decks, and games in the area of creativity, innovation, and design. I also wanted to acknowledge the team behind the book. So Steve and my names might be on the front of the front cover of the book, but there was a big team behind the book that contributed to making this happen, including our illustrators and graphic designers, Ellen Chen and Diana Ayub. They're running a fantastic little design studio called Shapeshifters. And we also were fortunate to work with two editors, Jacqueline Hall and Verity Borthwick, who were not just only excellent editors and helped us with putting the narrative of the book together, but also were able to contribute their own background in economics and earth sciences to the book as well. In the book, we talk about sort of the limits of good design, or the limits of human-centered design as a methodology for innovation. Now, I myself, as a design educator, have been teaching this to students and in workshops for more than 10 years, almost 20 years now. This idea and using this diagram that was popularized by IDEA, this idea that in order to come up with an innovation, we need to think not only about the technology and the business side of things, but also about the human values, which captures the things like desirability, but also usability, and essentially helps us to understand the user's needs, their desires, and great things that people actually want. And that sounds really great, and it has been great for many years. It's been great for business, it's been great for shareholders, it's also been great for users, but it's not necessarily been great for the planet and the ecosystems that we rely on for our prosperity. And the reason for that is that this little diagram, as you can see, actually completely ignores the impact of our design decisions, doesn't consider the impact of our design decisions on the environment and other actors that are not part of the design process. So to give you an example of this kind of human-centered innovation that doesn't really have a great outcome, long-term outcome, I want to use this example that some of you might be familiar with. It's called Chaucer. It was a startup, I believe, coming out of the Silicon Valley that attracted $120 million in investment. And it sold it was sold as an internet-enabled juicer for people could buy it for $400, and it promised raw, cold-pressed juice on your countertop whenever you're ready. And you can control it with your phone or with the Wi-Fi. Get different cartridges for the different flavors. So it sounded like a great little smart tech invention. The company collapsed after journalists discovered that squeezing the juice cartridges with 2 hands produced the juice quicker than the expensive internet-enabled device. So it wasn't a very great invention in that I just used a lot of electronics, unnecessary hardware, contributed to landfill, but not really serving a purpose. Now, to shift this way of thinking and to encourage designers and decision makers to think more holistically about the long-term impacts of the design decisions, we argue in the book for a shift to what we call life-centered design. So moving from human-centered design to life-centered design, which decenters the human. And instead of the human being the user or the customer being at the center of the design process with all the decisions sort of being made around their needs and desires, in life-centered design, we consider all of the different actors that have some kind of involvement or in some way impacted by the design decisions we make. And that includes not just human actors, but also non-human actors, which might be animals, plants, or ecosystems. And also considers the needs and the impacts on those that have not yet been born, so future generations. And we propose to simply, we're acknowledging that this is a simplified way, but we propose to support this mind shift by adding the environmental and ethical values bubble to this diagram, which focuses on the responsibility in perspective. And we argue that designers are actually ideally placed to be the custodians of this responsibility perspective. Now, to be clear, it doesn't mean that we as designers have to become experts in environmental sciences or conservation sciences, animal studies, plant studies, etc. But as designers, we're really good at collecting data, synthesizing the data, bringing different people together that are experts in different domain areas, and then representing that data throughout the design process and making sure it's considered in the way we're designing things. We've been doing that for decades now by essentially representing users that didn't have a voice in the design process. So we're arguing that designers now have an opportunity and a responsibility to do the same in order to represent the environmental and ethical perspectives. Now, to give you an example of what such a process and approach and a responsible innovation might look like, here's another example that we discuss in the book. This is a German startup called Meetup, which is a water purifying device. And this project started as a Kickstarter project, raised a lot of money, was very successful. They then got later investment from Danone to further develop the product. And it could have just become another Wi-Fi enabled smart home appliance, kitchen appliance. But the founders of this startup, the founders of Mitte realized that they were creating all these plastic devices and using electronics, and the devices would break and then end up in landfill. And so really started reflecting on the impact of their the devices they were creating and selling on the environment. So in 2023, they took a leap and completely redesigned the business model. And together with the backing of the investors, they relaunched their company as a company that doesn't sell these devices, but they rent them essentially out to users. So that means that the customer doesn't own the device, the company continues to own the device. Now that's really important, because what does that mean? If the company continues to own the device, it means the company is responsible when it breaks to repair it, and the company also is responsible to take it back when the customer no longer needs it. So consumers just pay essentially for the cartridges and not for the device itself. If the device breaks, they send it back and the company repairs it at no cost for them. If they no longer need the device, they send it back to the company repairs it and can provide it to another customer. So we also talk about in our book, and this is actually towards the end of the book, about 9 principles that we can use in order to cultivate a life-centered design mindset. And these principles were developed with some of my colleagues from the Life-Centered Design Collective, which is a collective of people from around the world working in user experience design, working as designers in industry, and also promoting this field of life-centered design. This is important because there was a recent study published in the Scientific American that found that the weight of all the human-made stuff, so like roads, cars, buildings, coffee cups, all electronic devices, the weight of all these things now outweighs all natural life on the planet, which is kind of insane to think about it that way. So it's all these things that we choose that have a negative impact on the environment and that contribute to all this stuff that weighs down our planet. This is kind of linked a little bit to this idea of the empty and full world economic models developed by the late Herman Daly, who for many decades was arguing for the limits of growth. And essentially what Herman Daly says is that a lot of the economic models that we're still using today were developed at the time many decades ago, where we were living in what economists at the time thought to be an empty world. So meaning there was an infinite amount of resources available for us to create things, to make things, to use natural resources, and also an infinite capacity of the planet to deal with all of that waste and to regenerate itself. Which you can see here in the empty world diagram, where the yellow circle represents the planet and its resources, its natural resources, and the black square represents the economy. But Herman Daly argues that we no longer live in an empty world because the amount of resources we're using exceeds now the capacity of the planet to regenerate itself. And this model was actually the foundation for Kate Raworth's economic model that she referred to as donut economics, which also adds some additional parameters and dimensions that actually allow us to measure how companies, organizations, or even whole countries perform against the different social and environmental categories. Now, this is important even for UX designers. Even if people in this room go like, well, I don't design physical things that weigh down the planet, there's still an impact of digital interactions and digital applications that we design on the planet, because all of those digital experiences run on top of a physical infrastructure that require not just cables and devices, but also entire data centers that need to run machines, servers to store data, to process data. Of course, even more significant now with the use of AI and the impact of AI on requirements in terms of computing power. And those data centers also need cooling down, they need electricity to run, etc. So even as UX designers, if we are designing on the digital interactions, we can consider life-centered design principles in order to design experiences that reduce the impact of people on the environment. And just some small examples to show you some small examples. For example, on Netflix, Netflix by default streams all the shows in HD. And some studies found that if we reduce the resolution to SD, standard definition, that would save up to 86% of carbon emissions associated with video streaming. And video streaming is one of the major contributor of digital interactions to carbon emissions. So we could include, for example, a small addition, like an extra button that says play in standard definition and save emissions, giving the user the choice to make the right decision and reduce the impact on the environment. Another example, and some online companies like Amazon already implement this, is to offer user to choose between shipping options. So for example, they can opt in to combine the items if possible, and even if that means that the items come slightly delayed, again, therefore reducing the impact on carbon emissions associated with the delivery of parcels. Now, these are actually both two good examples that show that we can give users the choice to make the right decisions. As designers, we can enable users to make those decisions, but they're actually also good for business because they actually reduce the operational costs of the companies behind those that are offering those services. And this relates to this idea of a 1% change that we talk about in the book, and I'm going to hand over to Steve to explain what we mean with that.
Thanks, Martin. Before I talk about the 1%, I just want to come back to a point Martin was making around the sort of empty world versus the full world concept from a couple of slides ago. For those of you who have watched the Mad Men series, the TV series Mad Men, there's a scene in that where the family goes on a picnic. They've got their car, they go out into the countryside, they find a nice pristine spot, they sit there, they spread out a blanket, husband and wife and the kids. The kids are playing, it's very picturesque, very bucolic. They have lunch, you know, it's all very lovely. And at the end of the picnic, they get ready to leave. Everyone stands up, they grab their clothes and their shoes, and they're about to head back to the car. The wife grabs the corners of the blanket, throws it in the air to clear the trash off, leaves it behind, takes the blanket, and they all walk off and hop in the car, and they just leave behind the rubbish. And for those of you who are familiar with that episode, and maybe some of you who aren't, but the idea was very firmly fixed at the time that was fine. You know, that leaving your trash behind was not a problem at all. Because there were so many of these lovely spots that if you happened to find one that had some rubbish in it, you might just shrug and find somewhere else. But that attitude has got us to the point where we put out into the world things that are really, really problematic. And a couple of years ago, a naval officer took a submarine right to the bottom of the deepest point of the oceans of the Earth. So the bottom of the Mariana Trench, 36,000 feet below sea level, to the very, very bottom, and he found plastic bags. He found plastic bags sitting on the surface of the dirt at the bottom of the seabed, 36,000 feet beneath the surface, and it just keeps happening. So this idea that we're living in a place that, you know, like is kind of empty and we don't need to worry about and clean up behind ourselves, and that the people who make things don't have to take responsibility for what happens with them afterwards, is well and truly in the past, and absolutely something that we really need to be paying much greater attention to. But this idea of 1% change is that where we've gotten to as a society and where we've gotten to from an environmental point of view is the result of constant and ongoing small changes that have built up over time. It's not that we've sort of had this great shift in the way in which we use materials or the way in which we consume or dispose of things, but it's built up over time. And the solutions look the same. The solutions look like small changes that compound over time rather than the need for short, sharp, massive changes. So as much as we might want to think about, well, what's a big impact that we need to do as a society? The answer for us as individuals is probably more like, what are small changes that we can design into the systems within which we operate that will build over time and keep building on themselves? So that idea of 1% change is something small that compounds, that has a much greater impact into the future. That sort of ties together a few different ideas around thinking in systems, thinking in life cycles, and thinking long term, rather than these short-term fixes or interventions that we might do. In the book, we talk about these sort of three pillars, if you like, of how we can change the way we go about designing things. And one of them is around networks. The other is around intervention. So how do we intervene in those networks and in those systems? And the last one is around how we actually do that as a collaborative effort and as a collective effort rather than as individuals. So networks, interventions, and partnerships. And within those, we've then got these different mindsets or different ideas that drive our understanding at different points. So from a network perspective, we talk about understanding the larger system within which we're operating and designing. As part of that, and as part of defining a system, we also then necessarily have to determine, well, what's inside and outside our system. What are the consequences that will come from the things that we're putting in place? And then this third point around capturing diverse perspectives so that we're not missing critical views around, well, what's really going to happen and what's good and what's bad, and what's beneficial versus not. We sort of present those in the book in a number of different ways. And Martin will sort of talk about a little bit more detail around how those things are then detailed as we get into the chapters of the book.
Yeah, so we use this as a structure for the book, and so each of those three pillars that Steve introduced are covered through three chapters. And in each of those chapters, we introduce some examples. We also start each chapter with a little story that we then come back to. And each of the tactics is presented through tools and strategies, or includes tools and strategies, which are things that we propose that designers and decision makers can start using in their own work. And we also end each chapter on a 1% change section. So coming back to this idea of change that compounds over time, and giving the reader the guidance for how to start doing that 1% change in practice. And we also have some level down and level up options in those sections as well. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those tools and strategies in the next few slides. And we're actually going to hand you back to Steve to talk a little bit more about systems maps, which is one of the key tools, and I guess also in many ways one of the first tools that we should start when we're talking about planetary impact as part of understanding the larger system.
So we have this idea that anything that we design sits within a larger system, and we really need to understand that system and take that step of understanding the system dynamics in particular, if the thing that we're going to put out into the world is to avoid as many of those unintended consequences as we were thinking about. The idea that in simply drawing a system map, we have to confront the idea, just like when you draw a customer journey, for example, one of the first things, or an experience map or an experience journey, one of the first questions that you have to grapple with is, well, who is that customer? Who is that user that's on this journey? And what's their perspective? And the same thing happens when we start talking about, well, what is this system? is we have to start determining, well, what's inside the system and what's outside the system. What am I needing to take responsibility for and why not? And it forces us to confront quite a fundamental issue, which is that the boundary of our system is probably arbitrary. And any boundary that we choose to define for a system is an arbitrary choice. And essentially what we're deciding in that moment is the things that I will care about and take responsibility for versus the things that are now going to be somebody else's problem. And we see it a lot in the way products are designed, physical products are designed in particular, where the choice of materials, the choice to use batteries rather than a power source, the choice of packaging that it comes in, etc. Most of those choices are actually ones that dictate somebody else's problem. So when I choose to package something and ship it using plastic, I don't have to take responsibility for the disposal of that plastic. It becomes the consumer and their local council's problem. You know, like it's a recycling program's problem rather than the manufacturer's problem. And this idea of, you know, sort of starting by drawing out this system map and understanding those dynamics and understanding those choices is fundamental in shifting that responsibility and the acknowledgement of that responsibility back onto the manufacturer, back onto the design team. This is a very simple example of what a system map might look like. More realistic system maps and more complex topics might look like this next one, which is, you know, around a much broader view of, you know, the interplay between the environment, the economy, the role of policy, etc., the interplay with health and the like. And you can see all of these different dynamics feed back on one another in quite complex cycles. It's why we talk about a wicked problem and complexity in systems rather than something being complicated. Because these things are feeding back on themselves, we end up in this situation where it's very difficult to predict necessarily what the behavior will be if we change one part. And so the nature of systems interventions and the nature of what we're trying to do here requires us to think differently about our design practice. There's one more example on the next page, which comes back to a simplified version of that same thing, but it looks at things like, well, what is the role of misinformation and fake news on social media? What is the role of you know, campaigns? You're in an election cycle in the US at the moment, and you're really gearing up for 2 months of fun and games. I know Arizona is going to be an interesting state for the next 2 months as that election gets closer. But this diagram talks about just this notion of, well, what are some of the interventions and what are some of the dynamics that are going on? And we talk about this in detail in the book. I just want to read a section of the book and a post that I actually, this is something that I wrote about 13, 14 years ago in a conversation with John Kolko, which is a name that some of you might be familiar with. But let me just sort of read this. This is from chapter 3 in the book, which is on a section around towards responsible innovation. Consumers are beginning to expect organizations to engage in environmental and ethical practices and to make those practices transparent. If people aren't satisfied with an organization's environmental practices, those that have the ability to do so will seek out other alternatives. Pressure on organizations also comes from investing firms who are starting to integrate sustainability issues into their investing criteria. Companies that fail to invest in sustainability now risk failing at business. Considering a company's social, environmental, and economic impact, referred to as the triple bottom line in management, is not new. The term was coined in 1994 and, like other initiatives such as the Environmental, Social, and Governance Framework, it's been adopted in practice, though sadly often reduced to an alibi for inaction. The tools and strategies introduced in the following chapters of the book offer designers and decision makers the means to hold organisations accountable. Organisations turn to the field of design to respond to market shifts and outperform their competitors. In this new era, designers and decision makers again have an opportunity to lead the way. Consumers may be the most important partner in this quest. Their ability to indirectly influence corporate agendas through their purchasing behaviour will be a powerful force in the fight against climate change. With organisations continuing to focus on growth and revenue, designers and decision makers can use the dynamics of neoliberal markets to drive positive change. Capitalism is often seen as the nemesis of environmental protection. With markets shifting in response to consumer expectations, organisations will be forced to change their practices to survive. Eslinger's, that's Hartmut Esslinger, revised capitalist model sees that by incorporating environmentally sound methods and materials right into their process models, organisations can increase their value and improve sales. In that section of the book, we're really trying to focus on what role can designers and decision makers play in sort of shifting us away from these problematic design practices and problematic products and services to something that's more balanced, less environmentally impactful. And this is a discussion that I was having with John Kolko, as I say, a little over a decade ago. He wrote me and asked me a question about progress. And this was my response. Are we really collectively wiser or simply more aware of our naivety and the danger that lies therein? A form of wisdom, granted. More cynical, certainly, and also perhaps more dissatisfied with our lot. Kai Krause wrote a piece, and some of you may remember the name Kai Krause. I can't be the oldest one in the room, but some of you will remember Kai's Power Tools, the plugin for Adobe Photoshop from the mid-80s and early 90s. Kai Krause wrote a piece a couple of years ago calling for a new contentism, which feels consistent with your notion of humanizing technology. The emphasis is on quality of life, on the benefits of tools, the liberating freedom. My real point, humans are feeble, we forget. We have become numb to all the wonder. He felt too much of what we view as progress is done because we can, instead of with a clear sense of purpose and progress in a human sense, a form of mindless communal psychosis driven by and driving an unsustainable cycle of materialistic and consumptionist activity. Although perhaps he simply sees us as ungrateful bastards, constantly clawing after more and better and cheaper. Quality of life has ceased to be measured in terms most of it would acknowledge as reflective of real quality. The new generation has a shorter life expectancy than their parents, are less likely to earn more, however you measure it, and will experience more and more extreme weather events. We lack a spirituality of technology or a clear purpose for the march of progress. As such, our progress is callous, cold, relentless, asocial, unapologetic. It cannot be human or humane for as long as the logic of progress is coached in terms of achievement and not value. I'm going to pause there and hand over to Martin, but the point I'm trying to make there is that we have a lot of agency and we have a lot of influence and power that comes with that agency, and our ability to shift the course of the things that are put out into the world and the point of those things is actually quite substantial, whether we wish to see it that way or not. Martin.
Thank you, Steve. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Mexico City, which I'm aware is much closer to Arizona geographically than to Sydney. This is based on an example that is used often in literature, and I'll pick up on it in the next few slides as well. It's the opening story of chapter 2. And all of our chapters have subtitles that sort of also play a little bit or are not to the stories and the things we discuss in a chapter. So chapter 2 is called Hidden Impacts of Design Decisions, and the subtitle is Highways and Cobras. Mexico City has a car problem. Home to 22 million people, the metropolitan area is sliced by highways, ring roads, and one-way streets that run from one side of the city across to the other. People rely heavily on cars, making it one of the most congested cities in the world. However, being stuck in traffic is not Mexico City's commuters' biggest problem. A complex weather system traps smog, pollution, leading to poor air quality and visibility. The phenomenon is especially vigorous during the winter months that follow the rainy season. It's a decades-old problem for megacities like Mexico City, which topped the United Nations list as the world's most polluted city in 1992, linked to rapid urbanization and rising car ownership. In the 1980s, the problem was so severe the government decided to tackle the issue. They established a task force, and it quickly became clear that fixing the root cause of the problem would take a long time. Instead, the city authorities were looking for an approach that could deliver immediate results, a quick win. And we talk later in the book about the fact that there are no quick wins when it comes to planetary impact. They also recognized that people would only change their behavior if compelled by the law. In 1989, driven by these insights, the government launched the Hoy No Circula program, which translates roughly to no driving today. The program proposed an instant 20% reduction in vehicle traffic through a simple mechanism. The last digit on your number plate would determine the day on which you were not allowed to drive your car. So it looked like this. If your plate ended on 5 or 6, you weren't allowed to drive on Monday. Vehicles with plates ending on 7 or 8 weren't allowed on Tuesday, and so on. The program was initially in effect Monday to Friday during the winter months, when air quality was at its worst, but was later changed to run throughout the year and include Saturday. At first, the mechanism appeared to work as intended. Traffic reduced and carbon monoxide levels dropped by 11%. But after a short while, emissions started to rise, overshooting the original levels. To get around the driving restriction, people were buying a second car with, of course, different number plates. Many were older cars, second-hand cars, making the situation worse by injecting a large volume of less efficient vehicles into the city's arteries. So that's an example of the hidden impacts of decisions that we make all the time as designers and decision makers, including the government. And this is also known as the Cobra effect, which describes this phenomenon where an attempted solution to a problem makes the problem worse or even creates a new problem. It's called the Cobra effect because it's based on a story of colonial India. So during the colonial times, Delhi had a problem with cobras, a cobra infestation. It was so bad that the British governors came together to find a solution, and they were again looking for a quick win and something that didn't cost much money. So they thought, we'll just get the locals to take care of it by giving out a bounty on cobras. So we get the locals to catch the cobras, they get a bounty. In no time, we'll have resolved the issue. I'll give you a moment to think about how the locals responded to this bounty scheme. Some of you might have guessed it. They started breeding cobras in their backyards. Of course, the British governors were onto them very quickly because they realized that there were suddenly so many more cobras that the locals turned in for a bounty. So they made another big mistake. They shut down the scheme overnight. Of course, what did that mean? It meant that all the cobras that the locals were breeding in the backyard became worthless overnight, so the locals had to release them into the wild. So suddenly Delhi had more cobras than before the bounty scheme. Hence why this effect is known as the Cobra effect. And I really encourage you to look out for these kinds of things in your organizations. I see them all the time happening, particularly in large organizations. So with that, moving on to the second pillar, jumping to the second pillar of our book, which includes 3 tactics which are visualizing the impacts. So that's one way to think about how to find out what are those impacts that are generated, for example, through a corporate effect. How can we visualize them and feed them into the design process? Envisioning futures, which I'll talk about more in a moment, and then implementing change, which is really all about prototyping, but doing different kinds of prototypes to what we normally do as UX designers. Futures is a really core part of the book, and also a core part when it comes to planetary impact and to understanding how we can reduce the negative effects of our long-term effects of our decisions, because that's the problem. Often decisions look really great in the short term, but we don't really look at or think about the long-term impact of those decisions. So we really need to shift from a mindset that involves the designing for the now, which is especially something that has been encouraged and fostered and embraced by the startup sector and the innovation hubs from regions like Silicon Valley, to what Brian Eno calls designing for the long now, so the distant future. And so we need to change how we go about making those design decisions. And one of the tools that we can use to do this is called backcasting. It's a futuring tool that starts with the future in mind. So there's usually a preceding step where we think about what would an ideal future look like. And again, in the book, we talk about different ways of how we can do that. And then we look at the future scenario, so the one on the far right here on this slide. And we map out that future scenario. So the example here is around electricity systems. And in the future scenario, we ideally want to have locally produced energy, we have a decentralized off-grid system, and we have things like neighborhood sharing. Once we've identified those characteristics, we then map them against the current state. So on the far left slide here on the slide, you can see the current state is we have a centralized energy system and it's controlled by large corporations. And so those are some of the contributing issues to why it's really hard to change our electricity systems. We then look at the transition steps that are needed in order to shift us from the current state to the future scenario. And so that might be things like having increasing this use of solar panels, having local battery storage, etc. We also suggest, and that's a bit of an addition to the traditional backcasting method, to look at specific projects. So projects that designers and decision makers can start working on, advocate for, work in partnership with others to get done. And so, for example, it might be to partner with energy startups, developing new localized grid solutions, run trials with local communities. So they become more specific projects that we can start to tackle, try to get funding for those projects, and start implementing them in order to shift us from the current state to the future state. We also suggest and talk about in our book how this could be done together with participants, and also getting participants to think as they're doing this backcasting exercise through the perspective of personas, including both human and non-human personas. So we're using what we're calling persona cards. You can see an example here for a student and an ibis as a representative of the natural ecosystem. And then also using things like concept that we call concept cards, which are typically based on research and propose or capture some future ideas, future concepts. And so these become kind of triggers to help participants to think about what that future state might look like and how we need to transition what we need to do to transition from the current state to the future state. So I'll see if Steve wanted to add anything. Otherwise, this brings us to the end of our slides, and we are going to transition into a Q&A session to see if there are any questions from anyone. And again, thank you everyone for listening to our presentation.
Let's Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much. And if anyone missed it, we were posting in the chat, but as mentioned, we are giving away a book to someone who lives in the US. So if you have not introduced yourself in the chat, please go ahead and do that. We'll be selecting the winner after we do the Q&A. So you can feel free to unmute and ask a question, or you can type it in the chat and I can read it out loud. But I can start off with a question for you both. So I think when you're working at a company or working at a big organization like University of Arizona, you're always kind of there's always the issue of like leadership. And so what are some things that that you can kind of present to maybe leadership who might not really understand these concepts or may not be kind of familiar with these kind of things? Is there any tips you have for how to kind of bring this work more into projects that designers are already working on?
I think the first thing for me, Carolyn, would be some of these techniques and some of the visualizations of things like a system map, for example, could be produced in low fidelity relatively easily without creating an impost on the project timeline or resources being used or any of those sorts of things. So you can start by saying, look, here's the system that we're working on. Here's how it sort of works from a dynamic point of view. We're going to change this thing. Here's how it's going to impact the rest of it. And you start having conversations about that kind of thing. But by doing a simple map like that and being able to have that kind of conversation, you can also then start to have conversations like, I'm concerned that by changing this, we're going to have a negative impact on this thing over here, and potentially, perhaps there are other ways of of achieving the same result. So by looking at the system dynamic, you can start to have different conversations about where you intervene and the scale of that intervention and the sorts of outcomes, both intended and unintended, that you might have. So it's a simple tool, but it creates very different sorts of conversations that you might start having internally. That would be, for me, that would be my starting point, and it's the one in my practice as a designer that I've leaned on most readily to start having those different conversations.
Great.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, likewise, in a similar way, I've been using backcasting actually often in those kinds of discussions. And if you're in a meeting room with a whiteboard, you don't even have to tell people that that's what you're going to do. You're going to do backcasting. You just start catching out on your whiteboard on the far right and go like, this is where we all be together in the future. We can all hopefully we agree on sort of like, this is roughly what it looks like. This is where we're now, and then starting to think and map out how to get there. And it's a really nice collaborative way to get people engaged. Of course, that assumes you're all in the same room, which you might not always be when it comes to leadership at universities. And also, having worked at universities, I have definitely witnessed some of the same challenges, Caroline. And also worked as a design academic. In many ways, I have worked as a strategic designer within universities, setting up new programs and initiatives that needed buy-in and support from the leadership. In that way, I really feel all three pillars are really important, but often I feel that the partnerships pillar is kind of like the most important, because the challenges are so big and complex and difficult to implement that it can't be done without partnerships. And so we talk about these ideas a bit more in that part of the book, in that third part, in the final part of the book. And one of the frameworks we introduced there is known as collective impact framework. So it's kind of a structured way of getting people to come together in a big organization through agreeing on a common agenda, agreeing on what the KPIs are, what activities need to be done, etc. And one of the key things I like of that framework is that this idea of having a backbone organization. So, and that can be within a big organization, a small group. It could be even, say, for example, within the library, if it's at a university setting, that the library plays that role. It can be anyone. I often think a little bit of our Transdisciplinary school, which is a pan-university unit, playing that role of being a backbone organization, driving change in a fairly large organization. We also talk in that part of the book about a framework that was developed through our research together with one of my former PhD researchers, Joel Fredericks, who was working in community engagement, where you have a similar problem. You have to sort of governments need to implement big complex projects, and they need to bring communities along, but also like driving that from the top. So we developed together this framework called middle out design. And it's this idea that you bring people from the representatives from the bottom together with representatives from the top, and they form this middle out coalition. And that coalition then becomes sort of the driving force. And so we talk in the book about how they can also be adopted in order to form that backbone organization that then drives change. And of course, also the idea of prototypes. One of the things that we talk about and that I've used myself a lot is what is referred to as provocation prototypes or prototypes. And even a one-pager can be a provocation prototype. So in my own work at universities, I would write a one-pager that is kind of like a bit speculative and not actually feasible, but it sort of tests out the limits of what we can do, and then giving that to the leadership to feedback on, and then often something comes out of that and you take it back into the process. Really good question.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. There's one more question in the chat about how are you both seeing AI integrated into what you all just talked about?
I'll start. And look, AI is an interesting topic, I think, for Martin and I for a variety of reasons. But there are opportunities for AI to be integrated into a systems view in a number of ways. And for me, one of the best ways for it to be integrated would be in understanding and simulating system dynamics rather than in its use within the design of a thing itself. So in a lot of cases, being able to, because a lot of the systems that we deal with are non-linear systems, they require simulation and modeling rather than a simple predictive model around how it's going to work. Artificial intelligence, computer modeling, if we get there, and when we get there, quantum computing and quantum algorithms will help with this kind of thing. But in order to understand what a specific intervention, what the impact a specific intervention might have on a system, and where the best point of intervention in that system might be to get things changing, I see a lot of benefit and a lot of potential in artificial intelligence systems being utilized. Where it's problematic is the AI queries, so search queries that are AI driven, chatbots that are AI driven, are extremely energy hungry in the context of an individual query. I don't remember off the top of my head, and Martin, you might, but they're X times more energy hungry than the same sort of simple database type query. So as soon as you start introducing AI into the mix, it becomes quite energy intensive. So much so that in the US alone, most of the new energy capacity that's been added over the last 5 to 10 years in renewable form, so wind, solar, and hydro in particular, has been bought up by large technology companies to drive their data centers and deal with the increased energy needs that are coming from artificial intelligence type queries. Now, that's not why we're putting in place renewable energy. The whole point of those renewable energy generation capacity is to try and draw down the use of coal, oil, and gas for our stationary energy needs, not to fuel artificial intelligence-based queries on the internet. So like there's a real sort of trade-off going on there where we're using it because we can, but we're not seeing the impact that it's having on our environment. So I see some really good things. The use of artificial intelligence in areas like diagnostic tools, the ability to see into imaging, X-rays, CT scans, MRIs, and pick up on things that a human might not see for months or years. You know, slight changes in cellular structure, slight growths in, sort of benign tumors or malignant tumors, and being able to tell the difference really early on when treatment can be more effective. The use of artificial intelligence in those sorts of areas, really, really promising, and the potential impact and value is really, really huge. Driving a chatbot on an e-commerce website, I'm not such a fan of. Martin?
Yeah, I was also going to say that's definitely an important consideration. And also like kind of like the example I shared with Netflix and HD versus SD streaming, something where it's about visualizing the impact. And again, that's one of our chapters. And visualizing those impacts to the user, because users often don't know that. They just use generative AI and not knowing about the impact of running those algorithms in the cloud on the server infrastructure. Apart from that, I mean, AI is an excellent brainstorming tool in many ways, and we do talk about that in the book as well. So in particular, when it comes to, for example, thinking about future states, what the world, what a future concept might look like. So again, the backcasting example, the backcasting canvas for that future scenario, or if you do scenario thinking, so like using AI as a bit of as a prompt for brainstorming and thinking about different future possibilities. It's a great way to resolve what is referred to as design fixation. So we sort of get stuck in particular ways of thinking. And so using AI for brainstorming can help us to get unstuck in a way. There's a great example that was developed by one of my colleagues here from the design school as part of Climate Week. The Climate Week program. So we have at UTS, at the University of Technology, we've got I think it's called the Data Arena. It's like an immersive 360-degree space with a large display and high-resolution display. And so my colleague developed an intervention where people can scan a QR code and then describe the future state in 3 words, so a few keywords. And that is then fed into a text-to-image model and generates some visuals, and then the user can then select one of the visuals that represents their idea of the future, and it's then projected on this data arena, which is really cool because you get this like visualization of how people envision the future in the age of climate change. So it's a very creative way of using AI and to start conversations.
Wow. That's really cool. And actually there was another question in the chat about you mentioned kind of the Netflix example. Do you have any can you share another example of features like the one you talked about for Netflix, so giving you the chance to choose to make a decision so they can reduce their negative impact?
Yeah. There are also examples of like actually applications that inform users. So I think there's an app called Good on You, which allows you to compare apparel stores or I think any kind of really shops in terms of their impact on environment. So you can make a more informed decision as a user. But then there's little things that we as web designers in particular can do. And in particular in Europe, I know that some of my colleagues from the Life Center Design Collective are working in that space. And in Europe, organizations and universities and large organizations are starting to also redevelop their websites through this lens. And that's just, there's actually quite a lot out there in terms of principles, techniques, and design patterns. I've also got a research student at the moment looking into that and developing specifically design patterns, UI patterns that encourage this kind of positive behavior and reducing the impact of user interactions in the digital space. But it's little things like carousels are really bad, for example, because a carousel means you have to preload all those images and then the website cycles through those images, but the user might not actually be bothered to look at the images because it scrolls straight down, or they're not interested in seeing all of those images. Autoplay of videos is really bad, or continuous play of videos. So is, of course, infinite scroll, and there's a whole different story behind the infinite scroll issue. Linked to, I guess, addiction and addictive behaviors, but it's also an impact on the environment because you have to sort of keep loading videos and images. So those are just some examples. So there's quite a lot. Also, obviously, the kinds of images we use, etc. Yeah. Steve, is anything that you want to do?
Yeah, look, some of the other things I've started to see are like around sort of delivery options, where you can select a longer delivery option, but it compares the sort of carbon cost of quick delivery versus longer delivery. There's an initiative being run at the moment by the International Maritime association. It's basically all of the world's largest shipping countries. So a consortium of large container shipping companies and that kind of thing. And one of the things that they've found is that by reducing the speed of a container ship by 20%, they can reduce the carbon emissions from that ship by 30%. Just by not gunning it across the high seas at full throttle, but just bringing it back to cruising speed instead. So just a 20% reduction, but then translating that into the choice that people make between delivery, fast delivery versus normal delivery type of thing, and reporting on the saved carbon emissions by doing so. We'll put it on a slower ship, and it'll save, X kilos in CO2 emissions. Similarly, some things around, I've started to see around the choice of a taxi when you book, and I couldn't find the example that I saw recently, but by being able to choose an electric or a hybrid taxi instead of an internal combustion engine or gas powered car, again, like making that conscious choice of an environmentally better or preferable option over the other. So those are just some additional things that we're starting to see.
And they're really good examples that demonstrate that tension between the bubbles that represent the human values and the environmental and ethical values. And it is a tension because, of course, as a user or a customer, we want instant shipping. We want it like in 2 hours delivered. But then as a designer, we have to think about the impact and also consider that responsibility perspective.
Yeah. And you'll see that in things like being able to offset the carbon emissions from a flight, for example. A lot of airlines now give you that option when you book a flight to offset the carbon emissions through some kind of, tree planting or carbon credit type scheme. So more and more.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to read one more question from the chat, and then I'm going to hand over to Bob. He has a question, and then we'll announce the winner. So the example of non-human personas was really interesting. Do you have examples of other design artifacts that could incorporate some of these ideas? I'm thinking service blueprints could be another good one, like a lane for ecological impact or something similar.
Yeah, nice. I believe I actually have seen something like that, an extended template, but this is a really nice idea and a good example of how, and also that's what we argue in the book, it's not about replacing human-centered design methods. It's actually about augmenting or expanding them, or using them in different ways, like the non-human persona template. That's based on quite a lot of research we've done with some of my colleagues at the university over the years, and there's some academic papers as well that we published about non-human personas. We did a study with the Life-Centered Design Collective together, applying that to the design of furniture. So we used the IKEA's Poeng chair as an example, and then used some life-centered design methods and reflected on how that worked and what the different outcome would be. In our research, I mean, it's maybe a slightly different space, but because some of my research is more in the urban environments, we also looked at applying the non-human personas to the design of parklets, which are kind of like little small spaces in urban environments where people can rest, charge the phone, etc. And so we're designing one of those, considering also non-human personas and possums as native species that often use cities as their habitat. It can be a bit tricky because there's not always a clear link between what we do, especially as UX designers, to non-human entities, non-human actors, and sometimes a bit more removed. So the example of using AI or data streaming for a video streaming platform, that's very removed in that the impact is somewhere where the data center is, but then again, there's some natural environment there, and there's an impact on non-human actors through that. But that's where the systems mapping becomes useful again, because we can look at the sort of the second and third order effects and not just the immediate ones. And it's a kind of a bit of a different way of thinking and a shift of thinking.
One last point I just throw in, Carolyn, in response to the question, is that there will be a very real tension internally between what is perceived to be the actual design task versus distractions from the design task, or tangents to the real design task, or why are we wasting our time on this stuff instead of the design task type of response. And it will be very real, and it will be something that will shift over time. But as organizations increasingly get asked to report on their carbon emissions and their environmental impact and their impact on biodiversity loss and various other requirements that will come into law and will be introduced. And America is a little different, but in the European Union, for example, there are some very strong requirements coming in that are forcing organizations to be able to report on these things. The fact of having to report will start to make these sorts of conversations much more central to the work of designers, because we will need to be able to measure in order to report. And in order to measure, we need to have a clear sense of the thing that needs to be measured and the impact that we're having and appropriate metrics to report on. So for now, I expect, and I would be ready for some pushback from your institutions and from your organizations that perhaps we're wasting our time and we're a little far afield. But there are absolutely ways that you can have these conversations, and in most cases, you can actually design in a way that is both better environmentally, but almost assuredly will be better financially as well. And as soon as you start to be able to demonstrate that connection and tie some of those, the benefits for those non-human personas and show the broader economic value that might come from that approach, you will get many more people within the organization starting to pay attention at the same time. So I'm just acknowledging the tension that will absolutely exist when you start having some of these conversations. And to Rebecca's question, like where you can start to introduce metrics into those design artifacts, be clear around what impact are we measuring and whose benefit are we designing for and what those trade-offs are. But start gathering evidence so that you can have better conversations into the future, because they will absolutely happen.
And relevant to all of the questions, I also wanted to add that we have the QR code here on the slide to the Books Companion website. And we've made templates available for free on that website as downloadable PDFs in order to implement all of those tools in practice. We also made all of the graphics and diagrams from the book available for free on the Creative Commons license as well on the website.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's almost like long-term planning for long-term designing, like very meta, like you have to plan long-term for the designing in order to make the design happen. But that's really good insight. And I think definitely when you can put some sort of financial spin on it, it always tends to get leadership here. So Bob, did you want to go ahead and ask a question? I'm not sure how we are on time. Yeah.
I think we're doing good on time. Thanks, Martin and Steve. Thanks for the inspiring talk. And Bob Liu here. I'm one of the UX at UA organizers, and I had the chance to read through this book. It is an amazing book. I appreciate all the little and big thoughts included in here that helps think, Steve, as you said, shifting from designing for now to designing for the long now. I especially like the Cobra effect example. You had the Mexico City's car example. I also lived in Beijing, China for a while and sort of witnessed the same problem happening there, and it's still going on. So I'm curious, throughout your design career, what are some other Cobra effect examples you witnessed?
One of my favorite ones that I sort of had to deal a little bit with as a head of school is activity-based working, which, organizations advocate for that because they say, by implementing activity-based working, where essentially it's hot desking, so people don't have to allocate a desk. They come in and find a desk and have all the stuff in a locker. The idea is that you find a desk that is, depending on your activity, you work with a team here today, another team tomorrow. And so it encourages more collaboration, more creativity, etc. But there are actually studies that found that it's the opposite because people hate not knowing if they even get a desk when they come to work in the morning. And apart from wasting time trying to find a desk. And so a lot of people decide to just work from home. And so that, of course, reduces the amount of incidental conversations that may lead to collaboration and also creative conversations. Steve, do you have another example from your work?
Look, one of my examples comes from the Australian sort of political and policy system, which is around the way in which we help, and I'll put it in quotes, help people who are experiencing unemployment. So when someone in Australia is out of work for a long period of time, there are various government programs that are designed to not only support them, but also support them back into a paying job and back into long-term employment. But the scheme has been set up in such a way that private employment services providers essentially just use unemployed people as a way of getting money off the government and bounce them between integrated programs that they offer. So they run a training program, they place them in a job that they own for only enough time to get the benefit from the government, which is 3 months in one day, and then they lose their job, which puts them back in the unemployed queue so that they get paid to train them again and get paid to place them again. And they just sort of bounce them around. And for the person, you know, like they're not getting helped at all. It's this sort of gravy train for the unemployed, the employment services firm. But really, it's just a way of bilking the taxpayer out of money. So no one is actually being helped out of unemployment. The same pool of people are continue to be long-term unemployed. But you've just got this cycle by which private providers get money from the government. That's an example for me. It's a consequence of putting perverse incentives, if you like. I actually read about one the other day from Alabama, where prison labor is being used in fast food restaurants. So private prisons are contracting prison labor into fast food restaurants. So a prisoner who's trusted to leave the prison each day and go and work each day in a McDonald's restaurant or a Burger King or whatever it might be, and then take themselves back to prison at night at the end of their shift, they're not being paid. So they don't earn even a minimum wage in their job because they're a prisoner. But the incentive system is such that there's now feedback loop in place so that people are less likely to get bail and more likely to get a custodial sentence when they are in fact found guilty of a crime, to feed that labour system, that free labour system in that county. That's another example for me of just a system that is in place purportedly for one reason is being used in a perverse way for something else. You're ending up with a lot more people in prison. And when they get out of prison, they're not allowed to take on those same jobs. They're deemed to be risky, even though when they were in prison, they were actually, they were fine to be employed because it was free labor. So anyway.
All right, since we have 10 minutes left, maybe
Yes.
it's time for us to announce our winners. And I noticed some other questions in the chat. Maybe a few of us can stay until the end, and so others can ask their questions. I want to pass it to Ali, who has been working on drawing the winner for this book. And Ali, your turn.
Thanks, Bob. I'm Ali, one of the UX at UA organizers, and thanks so much for the talk and for everyone who's able to join today. So for the folks who introduced themselves in the chat, I spun the names, and the magical online wheel chose Cosette as our winner. So thanks so much for introducing yourself. If you want to drop your email, you can private message me, Ali, A-L-Y, or Bob. Your email, and we'll follow up with steps to get that book to you. So really appreciate it. Thanks.
Awesome.
And that sounds like we're good for folks who want to jump off. They're welcome to at this point, right, Bob?
I think so. Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming to this talk. And thanks again, Martin and Steve, for this amazing presentation. Looks like we have an international audience today. So thank you again for coming. Hope to see you
Yeah,
again next time.
the person joining from Portugal, it would have been in the middle of the night, I'm pretty sure.
Mm.
All
Yeah.
interesting time zones.
I think one of the questions that was asked, which I thought was kind of a good one, was describe what you think the future will look like at the end of this transition. So as people start to use more life-centered design, what is like your optimistic vision for what this could really look like for like our world?
One of my answers to that question the other day, Carolyn, was being able to see the stars at night.
Nice.
I live in an urban environment, and just being able to see the stars at night, we pretty much can't because of light pollution, air pollution, various other reasons in built-up areas, and we just accept it. And yet the reality is, with some intentional design, cleaner air, electric cars on the road instead of petrol burning cars, and diesel trucks, and buses and trains that are run on electricity, and like energy being generated from solar and wind instead. There's absolutely no reason why we can't have clear skies in and around our cities. So for me, the two big things are being able to see the stars at night and being able to see the mountains during the day. There are mountains west of Sydney about 35 miles, and on a clear day you can see them. And during the pandemic, when all of the traffic was taken off the road and Sydney was in lockdown, I could see them. And you can't at the moment. And under normal conditions, you can't. It's a little better now, but you can't. One of the other ones for me, and again, like I live near the water. I live, as I sort of mentioned, I live on a bay off one of the major rivers in Sydney. And it used to be the site of a lot of industry further along the river, a lot of heavy industry. There were paint factories and various other things. And so the river was in a very bad way through the 90s and early 2000s, with industrial waste, flow off, chemical spills, a whole range of things. And when you look at it now, you start to see things like flocks of seagulls feeding on bait fish in the shallows because the water's much cleaner and there's actually life in the river system. And the thing for me will be, one of the things that I look for as in terms of what does that future look like is whales inside Sydney Harbour. And to see whales near where I live, under the bridge and in the bay where they're coming in, because the ecosystem has recovered so much, because those small fish have attracted larger fish, and those larger fish will attract predators and larger animals like whales, that I'll see whales near where I live. We see them going up the coast and quite close to the coastline of Sydney. You'll see whales at this time of year just a couple of 100 metres off the coast. And sometimes, and very infrequently, they'll come into the harbour, but the harbour's quite noisy. Big diesel engines, driving boats, like all of that kind of thing. You start changing those to electric propelled craft, and it's not as noisy in the harbour anymore. So you start to get this effect of, well, those animals, like whales, will come into the harbour and I'll see them where I live. So I think about those sorts of things. It'll be that kind of thing. It'll be buildings like the one across from where Martin's sitting right now, which is covered in greenery. The outside of the building is covered in greenery. We'll have a lot more of those sorts of bits of architecture out in the world. I saw an example yesterday from the Vietnamese National Design Awards of a development, residential development, where inside the building they used light wells and internal microclimates to use to drive agriculture. So instead of having these open spaces within the residential tower dedicated to empty space or artwork, they had rows and rows of vertical hydroponic agriculture instead. So this community, this residential tower, was growing a lot of its own food. Things like that, I think we'll start to see, but you won't see things being built, dug up out of the ground and burned to generate energy. That's not something that we'll see. Things will look back on, you know, petrol burning cars and cars backfiring and big clouds of smoke and that kind of thing, in the same way that we now look on, you know, restaurants filled with people smoking from the 1950s. You know, our kids will be looking at that going, what the fuck were they thinking? Like, why would you do that? Why would you do that? You know, these scenes on flights in the 80s of, you know, like the smoking section on a flight, as though everyone isn't in this sort of single contained space of air, but, you know, you had a smoking section. Like shit like that, I just sort of look at and think a lot of that will go, but the idea is that I dig something out of the ground, I use it once, and then I throw it into landfill, will be completely transformed. That sort of way of thinking will just disappear, but the result of it will be much more care taken on the design and the manufacture of things, so that the materials are more long lasting, more durable, can be repaired, things that you hand on to your kids or to a friend or a neighbor when they need something, rather than being disposed of after a few years. That will come back to being the norm. And funnily enough, that's a mindset that was prevalent when I was born. It's not new. It's actually a return to a way of thinking about how we make things to last, where we've kind of lost it through the 70s, 80s, and 90s in particular. And we're in this place where we design for disposal. You know, we use a couple of times and then we get rid of it, rather than actually things that we sort of keep and last. Those will be the big shifts for me.
I got nothing to add to that.
Yeah. I feel like that's a good note to end on. It's a positive vision to see the stars at night, to see whales in the harbor, somewhere where, yeah, we don't just design for convenience, but we design for this more circular ecosystem. So I like that. I like that vision a lot.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much for having us. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And yeah, have a good rest of your Friday.
Thank you so much. Enjoy your evening.